In what could be a precedent-setting case, the U.S. National Labor Relations Board says a Connecticut ambulance service acted illegally when they fired an employee over comments she made on Facebook. Dawn Marie Souza was dismissed from her job as an emergency medical technician after mocking her boss on the popular social networking site. Souza posted the remarks from her home computer on her own time. The NLRB says comments made on Facebook are protected under the First Amendment, the right to free speech.
Welcome back to Canoe Live. So what if the same thing were to happen here in Canada? Well, just last month in British Columbia, 2 employees at a car detailing company were fired for comments they made about their boss on Facebook. Now, in that case, the BC Labour Board ruled in favour of the dismissal, discounting the argument the terminations were retaliation for the recent unionization at the detailing shop. And joining me now in studio is labour lawyer Bram Lecker from Lecker and Associates, and from grassroots online social expert, media expert Brett Bell. And Bram, I want to start with you. Other than the obvious between the two cases, we have different labour laws here in Canada and in the States.
Most definitely.
Specifically to these two cases, from what I've read, it seems that there may also be a difference between the content of what was said. What was said in the case in the States was almost just like, oh, can you believe he made this decision? Whereas the case in BC was a little more serious. They deemed the comments to be homophobic and also to be considered threats. So would that be legally the main difference between the two cases, do you think?
Most certainly. I mean, the comments in the BC case actually, I believe, threatened violence and talked about, made references to the Dexter program, about the kill rate and things of that nature. And it's really the question of degree. But generally speaking, the comments have to go to the heart and root of the employment contract, in Canada anyway, and so to the extent that they would undermine the employment relationship. And certainly a comment where you're talking about killing or stabbing your employer or various employees would be problematic even in Canada, as it was in the BC case.
Brett, how is posting something on Facebook different than, say, it being said in a telephone conversation or in an email? And even then, with those things said, why do people think that you can say things on Facebook or in email or in text or whatever that you can't say in the workplace? Like, why do they think it's safe?
I think part of it is because it started off, like Facebook's a great example, it started off as a personal thing, right? Like ultimately it was something that you did on your own time and it was a personal thing. And now a lot of the stuff, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or anything like that, has sort of gone into the workplace. So now you sort of take something that you had as a personal context, very informal, you're talking to your friends and all that kind of stuff, but then all of a sudden it's now turning into something where it's actually in the workplace and actually affects your job. So I think a lot of times people look at it as sort of, you know, again, it's sort of a personal thing that they don't really think anyone's watching or anything like that. But I think what we're finding in these kind of cases, these types of things where it's a text message or Facebook posting, it's a record. It's a written record, essentially.
Yeah, private's not really private. Bram, I want to come back to you. Postings that are made off hours, because a lot was made in both cases about the fact that they were made off hours, they weren't made on company computers, because we all know that companies do have regulations when it comes to that. You can't use company computers, and even email is a company's property, right?
Yes.
So then if something is off hours, though, it's still, you're not still off the hook if you, say, make a reference to something that happened at work.
Well, if there is a contextual connection between the comment and work, that would be a problem, as opposed to a situation where you're making a personal comment about somebody who is at work. So it has to go to the employment relationship. And if you're calling your boss a slave driver, for example, is that fair comment, or did it really happen? But if you're you're talking about the financial stability of a company and making either unfair or incorrect comments, which would go against the confidence of that company or its reputation in the business community, that would be a problem.
Would it also be a problem, though, if you mentioned, say you have a problem with, it's not your boss, let's say, but maybe a fellow employee. If you have a problem with a fellow employee and you have some things happen at work and then you go and you post something about those incidents on Facebook, can you also be reprimanded for that because you're actually discussing something that happened at work?
Well, it's the nature of the comment, once again. If it's a comment which, for example, is hurtful, or is seen as harassment or under our new Occupational Health and Safety Act, the employer, or something that violates the Human Rights Code, for example, that is something the employer has to protect against because ultimately they're responsible. So once again, it would have to go towards the context of the employment relationship.
Brett, what's the best rule of thumb for posting on Facebook and us, other like MySpace and Twitter you mentioned as well? I mean, is pretty much the rule of thumb private is never really private when it comes to these sites?
It's always smart to be somewhat commonsensical. I think that ultimately you need to sort of, you always need to think twice before you press send. And I think that a lot of times, really good advice offline is, say, if you're thinking about writing a letter or something, you want to cool down or something like that. I think that's always really good advice, just generally in the way that you treat yourself. I think that ultimately who you are as a person, but also acting on behalf of the company, sometimes you just need to keep that in mind. I don't think any employer expects people to represent the company 24/7. But ultimately, you need to recognize that everything is in social media. When you're talking about social media, everything's inherently public. That's what it is. Social media. It's actually out there. So you need to just keep that in mind. Just use common sense. And I think that ultimately, making sure that you reflect yourself in a way that they always say, well, would you want to be on the front page? Would this on the front page of Toronto Star or anything like that? You need to sort of think about that, especially when you're dealing with controversial topics. Obviously, when you're talking about your own personal life and things like that, which you did on the weekend, that's fine. When you're making a comment about your boss or something like that, you have to think about. You think, how are they going to react? And again, how would this look on my friends, my family, even my company? If you do care about your company thing, how would this reflect on it corporately, and how would I want it to be reflected? And that's something you just got to keep in mind.
Sober second thought, right? I guess is the best policy. Very quickly, you brought up the new harassment laws, but do we need to keep changing our labor laws because of social networking and these type of sites, or are we keeping up with that pretty good with the laws we already have?
In Canada, we pretty well are. There's always it's a sea of conflict in essence and balance between the rights of the employer and rights of the employee. And I think we do a pretty good job in Canada of that. It is a progressive regime regarding employees, both in unionized, non-unionized environment. I think things are pretty much in balance the way they are.
All right. As I always say, if you wouldn't say it to the person's face, you probably shouldn't say it on Facebook. So what do you think? Join the conversation. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and online at canoelive.ca. We're taking a break right now and coming right back with sports and entertainment.